Last week I published a video that I was hesitant to release because the data was just so unbelievable. Using a preview build of Windows 11, I found that Ryzen CPUs were on average 10% faster for gaming. And this is really unheard of for a Windows update, and really it shouldn't lead to that sort of performance improvement, especially for CPUs that have been out in the wild for years now. But I think I found the issue, but before we get to that, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Antec and their new Flux Pro full tower case. This new addition to Antec's lineup integrates real timber on the front panel, as well as a textured multi-directional front grille, giving it a unique style while ensuring optimal airflow. As the name suggests, the Flux Pro offers Antec's patented dual lower air intake design and includes support for up to 9 fans, with 6 PWM fans pre-installed featuring a built-in ARGB controller. The Flux Pro also supports real-time CPU and GPU temperature display and a 90-degree I-shift PSU mount to allow for easy cable management. It also supports up to 420mm radiators in the top and front, along with various cooling brackets to facilitate easy installation. The black and white versions are now available for $180 and $185 US respectively, so for more information, please check the links in the video description. Okay, so leading up to last week's Windows 11 benchmark video, I did a huge amount of retesting to try and validate the data that I was seeing, but in the end, I found that in most examples, the 24H2 preview build was just much faster. And since then, many other users and members of the tech media have started testing the 24H2 build, as well as the recent update to 23H2. I'm going to say H2 a lot in this video, but that's just how it is. But yeah, there's an update that's meant to deliver 24H2-like gains for games. And the results from other people who have looked into this have been mixed, I think it's fair to say. Some media outlets have shown similar massive performance gains in certain titles to what I found, while others found more mild gains, some no gains at all, and some even found in certain instances performance actually regressed. So that being the case, I continue to dig into this further, and I think I have the answer, maybe an answer, I'm not sure. At least I have part of the puzzle. But before we get to that, I do need to issue a few quick corrections from the original video. Follow-up testing, which led to the creation of this video, found that my previous 23H2 install was underperforming, but only in certain games, making this entire process very confusing. For example, previously I found a big performance uplift in Call of Duty with 24H2, but it turns out my 23H2 install was just a bit broken. And thankfully I do still have that install, so I've been able to put it back in, do some more testing. And on that note, I should thank Team Group providing us with numerous 4 to 8TB SSDs. And that was for past content, not this content, but yeah, it's come in very handy. It's allowed me to maintain multiple Windows installs so I can swap them back and forth to try and work out what is going on. And it's really made this testing possible. Without a wide range of SSDs, this would have been a real nightmare, or a bigger nightmare than it's proven to be. Now, in the Call of Duty example, it turns out there were really only very minor performance gains with 24H2. But this led me to retesting absolutely everything. And after days and days of very confusing results and multiple fresh Windows installs, I think we're getting somewhere, or at least I hope we are. But before we get into the results, there are a few other things that we need to discuss first. First and foremost, all of this testing has been conducted on a clean, freshly installed copy of Windows. We're installing Windows from a bootable USB using an ISO from Microsoft. We're not cloning or doing anything like that. It's pretty much a standard installation. Now, security features are disabled for benchmarking as they can compromise the accuracy of the results. This means VBS is disabled. But we're not just disabling VBS in Windows, it's disabled at the BIOS level, so there's no chance it will still be active within Windows. As apparently there is a bug where VBS says it's disabled, but it's really still running. So just to be clear, virtualization-based security is disabled at the BIOS level. Also, other security features such as Windows Defender and the Windows Firewall, they're also disabled, and we do not recommend that you do this for your PC. This isn't some sort of setup guide or security advice. We merely do this for testing purposes to ensure consistency between benchmark runs. And this is how we configure all PCs for benchmarking. This is stuff we've talked about in the past, and the decision to disable VBS was made back when we first moved to Windows 11 based testing, as we wanted to keep the data consistent with what users were seeing on Windows 10, which doesn't enable VBS by default. Moreover, at the time, most motherboards disabled virtualization-based security by default, and even today, this is still true for many configurations. The process for configuring and benchmarking is pretty simple. As I said, we freshly install Windows 11 using a standard procedure and then disable the aforementioned security features. After that, the chipset drivers are installed and the system's reset. Then the display drivers are installed and again we reset the system. And then we install stuff like Steam and all our benchmarking software. And for a very long time now, we've been well aware that swapping CPUs back and forth can break Windows performance, especially when going from an Intel CPU to an AMD CPU. That's really a big no-no, that one. And I even made a video about this about 2 years ago now. But it seems since then, Windows 11 has become much worse with Ryzen processors, and I'm not exactly sure when things went wrong, but I can confidently say that in its current state, at least prior to the recent patch, 23H2 can be a bit broken with Ryzen, or really, it is pretty broken with Ryzen. And the degree to how broken does vary, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason for why this is. Shortly after releasing my video covering the 24H2 performance last week, Andreas from HardwareLuxx published an article testing 24H2, where he found pretty mixed results. There were some examples showing the big performance gains that I found, but then there were other examples where the performance managed to regress, and that's not something that I saw. Given that his data was quite different to mine, and a lot of people were reporting big performance gains on their own personal systems, he wasn't really satisfied with the results he was seeing, especially given that performance did regress. So he did go and retest, so hats off to him for all of that extra work. And he used the KB5041587 Windows update for 23H2. I won't say that too often, a bit of a mouthful, but there is a Windows update for 23H2 that's meant to deliver 24H2 light performance for the current public build of Windows. And when he did so, he found very different results. Much of his results were now in line with my original testing. So I suppose then what's going on? Why was he not seeing what I was seeing? And then through a retest, he ended up seeing what I was seeing. Did the 24H2 install not work correctly? Pretty difficult to say, but it does point to this testing being a bit messy. And of course, I have a lot more to say on that, which you'll hear as we go through this video. And of course, prompting him, as I said, to do that testing was we were hearing a lot of user reports of big performance gains in many games, or at least a performance uplift. And there were others in the tech media reporting this as well. KitGuru also benchmarked 24H2, and although they only benchmarked 3 games, they did find numerous examples within that limited data set of big gains for 24H2. So by this point, the general sentiment online was that 24H2, or the Windows update, was improving performance, but the degree to which it improved performance did vary, and quite dramatically. Now, something I noted a few weeks ago when investigating AMD's claims of missing Zen 5 gaming performance by testing with the system administrator account was that I noticed Ryzen's gaming performance was a bit all over the place. You see, we don't just do a lot of this sort of CPU gaming benchmarking around a major product release. Rather, we tend to do this pretty much all the time. So we always have loads of fresh data, and I've noticed from time to time that the AMD data does change quite a bit, much more than we see with Intel, for example. I've also mentioned this in the past, where an older set of results shows Ryzen processors averaging, say, 167 FPS in a game like Cyberpunk, and then a few weeks or months later we retest and we only get like 152 FPS on a brand new fresh install of Windows. But pinpointing why this is, what has changed during that period of time, it's quite difficult. Is it a new display driver that's to blame? Could it be the latest BIOS update, a Windows update? Was there a game update? The list of possible reasons for why there is such a drastic performance difference, well, it just goes on and on. It's also pretty rare that I'll install Windows 11, run a whole heap of gaming benchmarks, save that data, and then reinstall Windows and repeat that process all over again. But that's exactly what I've been doing for the last few weeks. And while doing so, I've discovered that Windows 11 23H2 performance can vary quite considerably between installs, though only for some games, making this all the more confusing. So part of what I'm going to show you today is 2 installs of Windows 11 23H2. One I'm calling the good install, as it generally provided much better gaming performance when compared to what I'm calling the bad install. Pretty simple stuff. If you just skip to the graphs, it's probably going to be a little bit confusing, but here's the explanation for what's going on there. Now, both of these installs are fresh. They were made with the 9700X, and they're configured in the exact same way. How likely you are to end up with a good install, I don't know. It could be a situation where 1 in 10 are bad. It could be something that's limited to my specific hardware configuration, though I don't think so given the results we are seeing from so many different media outlets and people. But I guess the point is I really have no idea how random this is, or even if it's random at all, though it does seem to be in my case. I don't even know why this is a thing. I don't recall this ever being a thing when we've done similar testing like this, comparing Windows 10 and Windows 11, or just Windows 10 testing or Windows 11 testing in the past. But this issue does explain why the review data has been all over the place, or at least it could help explain why, and also explain why those who have been investigating this update have found a range of varying performance gains. A lot of you have also been begging me since that video went live, and really since we started testing Zen 5, for comparative data with Windows 10. So I knew there was a lot more testing that needed to be done here, though I didn't realize how much until I really got into this video. It just kept getting bigger and bigger and more testing was done. I also wanted to benchmark with the 23H2 update, so we've got that data to go over as well. There really is a lot to cover here, and the graphs could have ended up being quite confusing, especially if I had added more CPUs, which I'm just focusing on the 9700X for this video. But even so, I have color-coded the graphs, so they look a bit uglier, a bit different to normal, but I think it's made them easier to understand, at least that's my hope. And please note, I've also cherry-picked the 23 games that we're using in this video. That's based on the previous testing with the 24H2 update, where we tested 43 games. There's really no point including the games where there was no performance to be had with the update. So being very transparent here, I have cherry-picked the 23 games that saw the biggest performance uplift with this new update. Starting with Hogwarts Legacy, at the bottom of this graph, you will find my two Windows 11 23H2 installs, one labeled good and one bad. In this example, the bad install was actually a few frames faster than the good install, which certainly doesn't look bad, but believe me, you will see some different results in some of the other games. Anyway, in this example, the good and bad installs are within the margin of error, just a 2% deviation here. Now, installing the patch boosts performance by 7 to 10%, which is a great uplift, and you might have noticed this gets Windows 11 up to speed with Windows 10. So there was certainly something wrong previously with 23H2. However, my 24H2 install is still 8% faster, which is a massive difference. How or why the 24H2 install is much faster here, I'm not sure. It could just be that this preview build of Windows trims off some of the fat, and this version should be released in the next few weeks, so we will learn more once it is officially released. The results in ACC are very consistent, and this was one of the games that didn't give me too many headaches. Both Windows 11 installs were consistent, rendering just 167 FPS prior to the patch, and with the patch they were very similar to what I found with 24H2, with a 6 to 8% performance uplift, which is similar but also slightly faster than what we were currently seeing with Windows 10. The Windows 11 results are also very consistent in Spider-Man Remastered. Prior to the patch, both installs saw an average of 153 FPS, and with the patch we're seeing the same 8% uplift that was achieved using 24H2. So great gains on offer here for Windows 11, and it's interesting to note that prior to the update, Windows 11 and Windows 10 are providing the same level of performance. So this update does boost performance beyond what you'll see with Windows 10. That is at least until Windows 10 also receives the update, which it has been suggested that it will. Now, Homeworld 3 gives us our first look at why the bad install has been labelled as such. As I said, I still have this installation of Windows 11 on a separate SSD, and no matter what I do, I cannot achieve better than 75 FPS from a 3-run average. But I have a Windows 11 install with the exact same configuration that consistently averages 81 FPS, and that's a massive 8% increase. But more confusing is the fact that once patched, both the good and bad Windows 11 installs are now averaging the same at 90 FPS, which is the same performance seen with 24H2 as well as Windows 10. This means we're seeing anywhere from an 11 to 20% performance uplift with the patch, depending on how broken 23H2 was to begin with. When testing with a Plague Tale Requiem, we find yet more unusual data that's different to the data that we've already looked at. Here, the good and bad installs of Windows 11 provide similar results, both before and after the patch, which only provides us with a 3% uplift, and that's much weaker than the 7% increase seen when using 24H2. Even more interesting though is the fact that 24H2 and Windows 10 provided the same results. Next up we have Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, and in this example, my bad Windows 11 install was a little bit faster than the good install, so go figure. Well, truth be told, the data is within the margin of error, and the good news is, with the patch applied, 23H2 is now matching the performance of 24H2. So we're looking at an 8% performance uplift here. It's also interesting to note that prior to the patch, Windows 11 and Windows 10 were delivering the same or very similar performance. The Watch Dogs Legion results are very similar to that of Cyberpunk in the sense that the two Windows 11 installs are very similar, and prior to the patch performance is on par with Windows 10. We're looking at up to a 10% performance boost here with the patch, so the same uplift seen with 24H2. So again, Windows 10 will need an update here to match Windows 11. For testing Far Cry 6, we aren't using the built-in benchmark, as it's not a very good CPU test. Now, what we are seeing here is that prior to the update, Windows 11 was broken in this example, though the degree to how broken it is may vary. Our bad install only averaged 162 FPS, while the good install allowed for 171 FPS. After patching, performance was much closer between the two Windows 11 installs, and both were slightly faster than what we saw on 24H2. Essentially, we saw anywhere from a 13 to 17% performance uplift with the patch, depending on how broken Windows 11 was prior to the update. It's also interesting to note that Windows 10 works fine here, matching the performance seen with 24H2. Now, the bad Windows 11 install was very bad in Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, especially when looking at 1% lows, and very poor 1% lows was something the initial HardwareLuxx testing suffered from. But even if we just look at the average frame rate, the good install is still 6% faster than the bad install, while the good install matched what we see with Windows 10. What's really interesting here is that the patch fixed both the good and bad Windows 11 installs, boosting them to the same level of performance seen when using 24H2. But this means, whereas the patch improved the performance for the bad install by 14%, we're seeing just a 7% uplift for the good install. So depending on your starting point, the performance uplift can vary quite a bit. We also have another example where Windows 10 will need an update to match Windows 11. The Borderlands 3 results are pretty straightforward. Both Windows 11 installs delivered the same results, meaning the patch was good for a 12% uplift here, allowing the patch version of 23H2 to match that of 24H2, which is also the same performance you'll see on Windows 10. The Callisto Protocol also indicates that there was something wrong with Windows 11 23H2 prior to the patch, though the degree to how broken it is will depend on the install. Our bad install averaged just 241 FPS, whereas the good install was 15% faster with 276 FPS, and again this is based on a 3-run average. But with the update we received a further 4% performance. Not a big gain by any means, but it means 23H2 is now on par with 24H2 and Windows 10. Previously, we didn't see big gains for 24H2 over 23H2 in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but we did see some gains, and that remains true even for the good install of Windows 11, which saw a 6% uplift with the patch. Windows 10 performance is pretty close to the patched Windows 11 performance. At most, Windows 11 is now just 2% faster, which is within the margin of error. Now, F124 was another game where the initial install of Windows 11 was performing very poorly, just 394 FPS on average, which is obviously a lot, but also a lot less than where it should be, which was 418 FPS with the good install. That's a 6% increase. Even so, the patch improved performance by a further 9%, and what's really interesting is that the patch fixed both the good and bad installs of Windows 11, allowing the performance to match that of the 24H2 build, making it slightly faster than Windows 10. The Riftbreaker is another game where my initial Windows 11 install, now labelled as bad install, was massively underperforming, rendering just 187 FPS. Meanwhile, the good install is 10% faster with 206 FPS, but even so, the patch will still improve performance by a further 5%, and remarkably was able to fix the performance for both Windows installs. Performance is now similar to that of 24H2, as well as Windows 10. Remnant 2 is another game where the previously tested Windows 11 install sucked, just 103 FPS on average, whereas the good install achieved 111 FPS, and that's an 8% increase. Now, once again, the patch seems to have fixed both Windows 11 installs, boosting them to a similar level seen by Windows 10. So it's around a 6% increase for the good install. Interestingly, the 24H2 install is still 7% faster, which is similar to what we saw in Hogwarts Legacy. We have another example in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, where the performance varies quite a bit between the Windows 11 installs that I've dubbed good and bad. Again, both systems are configured in the exact same way, yet what we're calling the good install is 7% faster when comparing the average frame rate to that of the bad install. And this means even the good install was still 8% faster with its patch applied, bringing Windows 11 up to the same level of performance seen from Windows 10. Again though, even with the patch, the 23H2 build is still a good bit slower than what we saw with 24H2. Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord saw just a 2.5% discrepancy between the good and bad installs, which means the patch resulted in a 5 to 7% performance uplift, allowing Windows 11 23H2 to match what I saw with 24H2. World War Z is another game where the bad Windows install is quite a bit slower than the good install, 7% slower in this example. But again, the patch seems to correct both installations, and even in this example elevates them to the same level of performance seen with 24H2, which is a little faster than Windows 10. So even the good install still saw an 8% performance increase. Forza Horizon 5 is another game that previously didn't see a huge uplift, but there were still some decent gains on 24H2, 6% when compared to the bad install. The good install was just 2% faster, so just within the margin of error for run-to-run variance in this title, so we're only seeing a very minor improvement with the patch. Quite oddly, the bad Windows 11 install was straight up broken in Forza Motorsport. I've since gone back and popped that SSD in to check the results and found for whatever reason, this install averages just 167 FPS. Yet if I swap out for the good install, we're looking at 194 FPS, which means the update is only improving performance here by around 3%, and not the 20% that I found previously with our bad install. So quite similar to what we found in Call of Duty, for example. But that isn't to say that you won't see good gains in this title with the update. It just depends on how broken your 23H2 install was to begin with. Gears 5 continues to deliver problematic results. The good install is 8% faster than the bad install, which is a huge difference, but even so, we're still seeing a 5% improvement with the patch, though that's nothing like the performance seen on 24H2, which enables a 17% increase over the good Windows 11 install. Also, even with the patch, 23H2 is still slower than that of Windows 10. Finally, we have Fortnite, and in this example, the bad install is really bad with just 294 FPS on average, meaning the good install is 16% faster. But even more unusual is the fact that patching both versions resulted in the same performance of around 360 FPS, which is about what you'll see on Windows 10, maybe a little bit higher. But it's also less than what we saw with 24H2, so the good install saw a 6% increase with the patch, but 24H2 was still 7% faster. Now here's a look at the average performance seen across the 24 games just tested, and again be aware that these are cherry-picked titles from our previous 43 game benchmark. I'm only testing games that previously showed good performance gains for 24H2 over 23H2. So as a result, the uplift is going to be exaggerated. We're seeing a 7% uplift on average for the good Windows 11 install with the patch applied. So if we were to test, say, 40 games, or a sample of games that weren't cherry-picked to show how big the gains can be, the uplift would probably be more like 4 to 5%. So the results are certainly less impressive than what we originally found, but there can still be a lot of performance to be gained with the new patch, and in certain cases, the patch didn't yield the great results seen with 24H2. Speaking of which, here's the 24H2 versus 23H2 prior to the patch, using the good data, and this looks more in line with what we found originally, a 9% uplift on average, and a number of double-digit gains. Now here's a look at the Windows 11 install prior to the patch versus Windows 10. Here we found that even our best Windows 11 23H2 install was still on average 5% slower than Windows 10. It's not a big margin, though there were a few games where Windows 11 in its current state is clearly slower. However, with the new patch applied, Windows 11 23H2 is now able to match Windows 10, coming out a few percent faster overall. Gears 5 still appears problematic on Windows 11, but outside of that, most games were within 3% in either direction. So it does seem as though 23H2 was broken, at least for Ryzen, and we didn't really notice this as we don't do these Windows-focused benchmarks very often. Though, having said that, I did at times notice the inconsistent results with certain installs. I just wasn't sure what the culprit was. Yeah, so that's a mess, but it does help to explain why the reports have been a bit all over the place. I'm sure there's other factors at play, but yeah, Windows 11 sucking probably is one of the major factors. And it's really confusing as to how two Windows 11 installs on the same system, configured the exact same way, can deliver such different results. But only in some games. In fact, the variance between the games tested is just as confusing, and it makes diagnosing the issue extremely difficult. For example, if you used games such as ACC, A Plague Tale Requiem, Borderlands 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Hogwarts Legacy, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Spider-Man Remastered, and or Watch Dogs Legion, for example, to verify your Windows 11 installation, you'd find that performance was pretty much as expected, as we saw no difference between our good and bad Windows 11 installs in those games. Likewise, as we discovered in the previous 40-game benchmark, titles such as Hunt Showdown 1896, Skull and Bones Starfield, Horizon Forbidden West, Returnal, Ashes of the Singularity, Baldur's Gate 3, Counter-Strike 2, Assassin's Creed Mirage, Hitman 3, The Last of Us Part 1, Warhammer 3, Halo Infinite, Dying Light 2, and Horizon Zero Dawn, they all saw less than a 5% variance when comparing 23H2 and 24H2, meaning that the good and bad Windows 11 installations would result in identical or very near identical data in all of those titles. And this means of the 43 games tested, just 13 of them showed a notable performance difference between the two Windows 11 installs. So my initial reaction here was that I'd clearly done something wrong. Either I recorded the data incorrectly, or there was settings that were set wrong. Thankfully though, again thanks in large part to the support that Team Group has given us over the years, I had many SSDs and the troubled Windows 11 installation was still there. I didn't bother writing over it again, I just grabbed a fresh SSD and started again. So I have all these various installations and I can just pop them in. The computer's none the wiser as to which one I'm using, it's just they swap quite seamlessly because I'm using the exact same hardware. So I could just easily go back and check the data using the bad Windows install. Simply pop in the SSD and away we go. And the problem is, it wasn't as simple as me just making a mistake. Those 13 games, along with Call of Duty, they still underperform to this day using that version of Windows. Of course, I can apply the patch to it and that seems to fix the problem. But yeah, all the other games run just fine. Sadly, I have no idea why that is. Maybe someone who's a bit of a software expert can help us out on this one. Makes no sense to me that some games see wildly inconsistent results while the majority are fine, or at least providing consistent results. So this inconsistency in those select titles is adding a layer of complexity to this testing. It's also just a nightmare for reviewers, as you generally want to fresh install Windows with every CPU test. Thing is though, the 9700X could end up with a good install, and the 7700X, for example, that could end up with a bad install, leading to a much bigger margin between those two processes than you would see otherwise. So my hope is that 24H2, that gets rolled out shortly, and it addresses this issue. And speaking of the 9700X, I should just note, before this, we go back to the whole Zen 5 thing, that if you were to install Windows on the 9700X, which we've clearly done, and then install the 7700X while maintaining that same Windows installation, you will find very similar scaling to the review data. So that is to say the 9700X still isn't much faster than the 7700X for gaming. The inconsistent Windows 11 23H2 results aside, what I did find very encouraging is that the KB5041587 patch not only boosted performance for the good install in a lot of the games, but it also seemed to magically fix our bad install. And something else that I haven't talked about yet, but it's a very important detail, is that with the new Windows patch, or the 24H2 build of Windows 11, the operating system was far more consistent with the FPS data that it was giving me. And a simple example of this would be Rainbow Six Siege using the built-in benchmark. Prior to the patch, 23H2 saw massive run-to-run variance in Rainbow Six Siege. And this has become a problem for a long time now. So much so that I actually stopped testing with this game for my day one reviews because I just found it far too inconsistent. And really, to get data that was even remotely accurate, I had to do away with our 3-run average and start with a 6-run average. So it takes a lot more time, obviously, to run a 6-run average. It's twice as much work, but I had noted this several times in the past and explained why I did stop using that game for the big benchmarks where I'm testing loads of CPUs. If I'm testing just 2 or whatever, then it's not too much of a big deal. But the reason for the 6-run average was due to the fact that one run could see an average of, say, 570 FPS, and then the next run could drop down to 510 FPS or possibly even lower, and then I'd just run it over and over again. I'd get results, maybe it'd be back up to 570 or it'd be 540 this time. It was sort of all over the place. And I wasn't seeing this sort of wide range of numbers on Intel processors so much, so I wasn't sure if this was something going on with the Ryzen CPUs or just the game. And some games do have quite a large run-to-run variance, but again, this was something that seemed more of a problem for Ryzen CPUs. And normally it's the more dynamic in-game testing where we see quite a large or larger run-to-run variance, not scripted built-in benchmarks where you just fly through a level. But the good news is, testing with the patch installed or with 24H2, I saw considerably more consistent run-to-run variance, generally only deviating by 3 to 4 FPS. And it wasn't just Rainbow Six Siege that tightened up. I saw this in a number of the games we were testing with. So again, my hope is that these updates, or hopefully 24H2 gets rolled out shortly, and that's what I will start testing or retesting all of our CPUs with. I've also got Intel CPU data coming. Again, I'm not sure. I might do like a preview of that with 24H2. Started testing with the Core i7-14700K. There are definitely examples of performance improvements for the Intel CPUs. It happens in more of the outlier titles like Gears 5. So this isn't exclusive to AMD processors. It's definitely more impactful, I suppose you could say, with Ryzen processors, but it looks like at the very least you're getting about half the uplift that we're seeing for Ryzen with Intel CPUs. So there's some gains there. Again, once I sort through all this and get the data where I'm happy with it, then we'll continue to do more and more testing. But right now, not super happy with the inconsistent results we're seeing, though, again, the patch does seem to address that. Not quite the level of performance in some instances we're seeing from 24H2. So I think it's probably going to make sense to wait for that build of Windows to go public, get the ISO for that, start testing on that, see how consistent the results are and what the performance is there, and then move forward with that. So there's plenty more work to be done. So if you appreciate what we do here at Hardware Unboxed, then just hit the like button. I mean, you've already done a great job. Thank you for watching this video to this point. Hopefully you didn't skip any of it because probably worth watching the whole thing. And yeah, you can become a member. There's some links in the description to get access to our Discord server where we talk about a list data as I'm getting it and whatnot, and see what you guys are seeing, all that sort of stuff. There's also live streams, behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So check it out if you're interested. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And again, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.